Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight what I want to talk about really are the fighting warships of the Tudor Navy, be it Spanish Navy, the French, or more importantly the English Royal Navy. It's quite interesting when you start looking at the history of military services, because obviously the RAF, the Royal Air Force, is relatively a new one. The army, because of the division during the English Civil War, be it Parliament and Royalist, means it is known as the army, which obviously dates back to really 1645 onwards. But the Royal Navy has a long history. After all, it's known as the senior service in Britain, and that's really down to the fact that Henry VII had a Royal Navy, Henry VIII had a fantastic navy, and that's what we're concentrating on tonight. Now, over the lockdown period, I'm sure you've been kept busy doing the gardening, maybe reading a good book. In Helen's case, it would have been updating the website and helping do these videos, for example, cooking all wonderful things. And I've been in the store doing all sorts of things, repairing and making. And it's interesting because I found lurking in my store the hull of a Tudor warship. Obviously not an original one, but a hull of a Tudor warship. So what I did is, during the lockdown period, over quite a few weeks in fact, I started to sand it. It was made out of wood. I started to look at altering it slightly to make it a little bit more authentic. I decided to put some masts on it. I looked at the sails, for example, and then I looked at things such as the colour scheme of warships, for example, at that time. And what I ended up with is this, and I do hope you like it. There we go. Don't know if that's in full screen there, but that's my little Tudor warship. One of the projects that I've done during lockdown. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second. Now, let me take you to probably one of the most famous battles of our Royal Navy in the Tudor era, and that happened in 1588, and it's quite an iconic one. It's the famous Spanish Armada. Obviously, by all accounts, Elizabeth I had upset Spain so much, and obviously we'd broken with the Catholic Church by that point, and Spain sent a huge armada which was initially sighted just off Cornwall, and the Royal Navy didn't really go out and fight them straight away. The famous story is that they were playing a game of bowls and they said, we'll finish the game first and then take on the Spanish. The funny thing is, though, that was really down to the fact that the wind and the tides were not good for the Royal Navy, so technically they had plenty of time to play their famous game of bowls. But eventually the Royal Navy came out to fight them. Now, we've got a lot of evidence about Tudor Navy. In particular, we have the famous Mary Rose down at Portsmouth. And I would draw your attention to a couple of books that I would highly recommend if you're interested, for example, in the Mary Rose or interested in the Tudor Royal Navy. The first one is the first book that Helen bought me on the Tudor Navy, and it's absolutely fantastic. This is called Before the Mast. It's a chunky book, and it covers life and death aboard the Mary Rose, and it's a full archaeological survey in a way of the Mary Rose, because it covers in great detail all the finds to do with what I would say the domestic life aboard the ship. However, she did very kindly buy me another book, which is actually 2 volumes, and that is this one. And this is the Weapons of War, and this one, which, as I said, comes in 2 volumes, covers the whole of the weaponry on board the Mary Rose. Now, we're not just talking about cannons here that you would expect to find on a ship. We've also got in here things such as the billhooks, the bows, and the huge number of arrows. And it is absolutely fascinating because years ago we didn't really know how powerful medieval bows were. We didn't really know a great detail about bows really, apart from the fact they were made out of yew. But on the Mary Rose, a huge number of bows were found, and a huge number of bows were in fact tested. And obviously that tells us that some of them had £100 pull on them, if not more than that. So I've got a big interest in the Tudor Navy, as I would have with anything to do with the military really. But like I said, if you look at the army, let's say about 1645 is when they really start. The Royal Air Force really not until just before the First World War with the Royal Flying Corps. But the Royal Navy has been long established. It's the senior service. So by the Tudor period, by the time the Mary Rose comes along, by the time the Spanish Armada takes place in 1588, the Royal Navy was pretty well established. Anyway, lockdown. I managed to make a Tudor warship. And just to remind you, there it is. So I'm going to give you a little guided tour using a pencil as a pointer. A little guided tour of this Tudor warship. So these are made out of wood and they're not clinker built. If we look at Viking ships, the boats are actually clinker built, so the planks overlap. These don't. This is the relatively new style, shall we say. They're not the biggest things, believe it or not. Saying that, when you stand by the wreck of the Mary Rose now in the museum in Portsmouth, it looks absolutely huge, and that's only a fragment of it. But comparing it with more modern ships and craft later on, they're not that big. But if we start at the front there, we've actually got at the front a little figurehead. Not all these ships had them, but a lot of them did. And it's attached to what was known as the beak that sits out at the front there. It could be used as a fighting platform, but it is generally used for maintenance, and it was also being used as a toilet, which is what you also see on ships like HMS Victory. It's often referred to the head, and there's usually a drop chute that drops all the sailors' wheeze and poops straight into the sea. Then we've got the bowsprit, which actually has a sail attached to it. I attached that sail just the other day using cotton. It's probably the thickest stuff to keep it within scale, to be fair. We have at the front here the start of the keel, which goes all the way down, all the way along and underneath. And to go with that, we also have the forecastle at the front there, which is often known as the forward, or also referred to as a foresail. It's an abbreviated term really. It used to be a huge fighting platform, especially on medieval ships. It still was, to be fair, on these Tudor warships. Then we go down to the waist of the ship, just of here, and those white boards running along the side, and I've got them this side as well, they're actually pavises, and we find these on the Mary Rose. In other words, they are slotted in so they could actually be removed, and they would have tiny little arrow slits in, so it allowed people to shoot arrows, or even guns, remember, firearms, from out between them. And obviously the wood would protect them to a certain degree from any projectiles going in their direction. And then at the back there we have the aft castle, which also is the important part, because this also has things like the poop deck, which is where the ship was steered from. So it's quite an important part of the ship at the back there. But you will notice it's very much like a castle. So you've got a forward castle and a rear castle, because at the end of the day, these ships were in fact fighting platforms. And then right down at the back here, we have at the stern the rudder, which is very important to help it manoeuvre with the help of the sails. We have at the front here a foresail. We then have the main sail in the middle, and then we have a mizzen sail at the back. Generally 3 main sails for steering in power, but they often have an extra sail. Sometimes you have the 4 masts, sometimes the 3 masts. What you will see running along both sides as well are those little windows. They are marking where the decks are, and these ships had multiple decks, and the little windows are in fact the gun ports. They would open up, they would flip open, the guns would be rolled out and they would fire. It's interesting, a lot of the guns on the Mary Rose were in fact field guns that were being put on board ships, so were not technically naval guns. They did have some naval guns, but a lot of them were in fact field guns being repurposed. The beams on the top here I've only added on to represent where the anti-board netting used to stand. On the ships at the time, they used to have nets strewn across the top, very thick very much like cargo nets of today or fishing nets. And that would prevent enemy from boarding the ship, because obviously the enemy may go alongside, they may jump across onto the ship. We've all seen the pirate films. However, they would then end up just literally hanging on the nets above, and they would make easy target there. So anti-board netting, that is actually what killed a vast amount of people on the Mary Rose, because as the ship went down, no one could get off. A lot of the guns had rolled into the gun portways. They couldn't get them open. Some of the gun ports were shut anyway, but the worst of it all was the netting. No one could get off because the netting held the men where they were, and the ship went down with them all drowning on it. So we've got at the front there the prow, the front of the ship. We've got at the back here the stern, and obviously there's a port in starboard, which we always have to teach children so they know which way to go. If I said man the port guns or the starboard guns, we turn the classroom into a ship usually when we do about the Tudor Navy. And then on the mast, and I've only got one here, but you have them on most masts anyway, you would have the crow's nest, which was used for observation, for seeing enemy ships, seeing land. It was also used as a fighting platform in its own right, so you could have archers up there, or even people armed with the calivers or arquebuses, these Tudor muskets really. We could do a video just on them at some point. So that's a bit of an overview of what these Tudor warships like. I've painted mine from contemporary pictures, so almost the dazzle camouflage that you see on ships in the First World War, but there is a distinct difference between these and Spanish ships really. If we take a look at the Spanish Armada in 1588, the English ships were actually very small scale ships, and what you have to remember is the Royal Navy did actually requisition a lot of fishing vessels and trading vessels for the Spanish Armada as well. Just like all the locals formed these militias to defend their land from the Spanish invader. And the ships, even though they were small, were pretty fast vessels, mainly because they were relatively light in the water. So they were very manoeuvrable, very small, and very low to the water. You will see they're not that tall, these ships aren't. And the famous thing about Royal Navy gunners at the time is they were very, very quick. They could pour out cannonballs at enemy ships really, really quick. The tactics of the Royal Navy in 1588 was mainly to run alongside their enemy and blast at the rigging, the sails and the mast, because at the end of the day, most of these ships were repurposed. The only thing that makes them a Spanish ship, technically, is the flag. So what they generally did is damage the enemy ships to the point where it cannot go anywhere anymore. Without sails it cannot sail, and then they can capture it and then repair it and use it in the Royal Navy. So it's not a case of sinking the enemy ship. However, if we look at the Spanish ships that were involved in the Spanish Armada in 1588, they were known because they were huge, they were big, they were bulky. A lot of them were extremely tall. You see in the drawings where these castles come up a very, very long way. And their gunners, and I will have to say this, were not the best in the world at all. They were not very good. They were very slow at firing. And the Spanish tactics at the time was literally to blast at the enemy ships, at the woodwork, at the oak of the ship. And their role would then be to run up alongside, throw in the grappling irons over, and the Spanish tactic was always to board the enemy ship. And it's quite common, you read about Spaniards holding grenades or grenados, lighting them and throwing them in through the netting and trying to cut through the netting to get on the decks and then work their way through the gun decks and eventually capturing it. Amazingly, in 1588, our weather in the English Channel destroyed the Spanish fleet, to be fair, plus the Royal Navy, but it was also the weather, and Spain ended up going home with a very few amount of ships really. So that's been a bit of an introduction, not only to the English Navy in the Tudor period, but also into one of the projects that I've been involved with during lockdown. Let us know what you've been up to. Is there any other model makers out there that's been making ships? Let us know, and we'll see you soon. Stay safe. Bye.